this video we'll talk about the respiratory system. Now the respiratory system is part of your cardiovascular system in that it's getting oxygen into your blood vessels and it's getting carbon dioxide out, right? Allowing your blood to get the oxygen it needs and get rid of the carbon dioxide it does not need. So let's look at first the important structures in your respiratory system. First, when you breathe in, you might breathe through your mouth or you might breathe through your nose, and then it goes to your nasal cavity where some of that air is warmed and filtered through nose hairs and mucus and things that trap dust. Then it goes back through your throat. We talked about that with the digestive system, also again called the pharynx. And then down passes your voice box called your larynx. So I'm talking by sending air across my voice box and my vocal cords are vocalizing there. Okay, we're not going to use the esophagus here. That would go to the digestive tract, right? But the trachea is the important structure. That's your windpipe. That carries air into your lungs. Your epiglottis blocks it when you swallow so that you don't choke. And your windpipe is obviously carrying air to the lungs. Then if we go down, the trachea branches off into two structures called bronchus, and then they break off into smaller tubules called bronchioles, means little bronchioles, and they, if we keep going down, go into these little tiny sacs at the end. Again, we see these folded sacs to increase surface area, to increase the efficiency of gas exchange. Those are called alveoli or alveolus. And they again are where gas exchange is going to occur. Notice they're surrounded by blood vessels. So we have the blue deoxygenated blood coming in. It's again coming in contact with the alveolus and it's getting oxygen. It's picking up that oxygen, binding to the hemoglobin, carrying it back out into the to the body, back to the heart, through the pulmonary circuit. Then it goes to the body, right, through the left atrium and ventricles. Okay. So those are important structures. Oh, another really important structure is your diaphragm. That is a voluntary muscle down here that when it contracts, it pulls down and opens air into your lungs, allowing your lungs to fill up with air. So let's look at how that breathing process works. Okay, so breathing is actually called a negative pressure process, right? Because we're not forcing air in, we're pulling air in. The way we pull air in is your ribs, the muscles in your ribs, when you take a breath, they flex and they expand, and they expand to increase in volume, and your diaphragm, when it expands, it contracts and causes the diaphragm to go down. So the area of your lungs, that cavity, when you take a breath, increases, and that pulls air into your lungs. Your lungs are not muscles themselves. They're essentially, you can think of them as like air sacs that fill up with air when these muscles around them contract. So that pressure pulls air in through muscle contractions. When you exhale, what's happening is you're relaxing your diaphragm and it's going up to its resting position. Your rib cells stop contracting, so they contract and they come back down, and the volume of the lungs decreases, and that pushes air out. So that's an exhalation. Versus contracting those muscles causes air to go in, inhalation. But again, it's negative pressure that causes air to get pulled into your lungs. Okay, so if we look at the alveoli, those tiny little sacs, you can see again these tiny little folds that again increase the surface area for gas exchange. So we've talked about this with capillaries, tiny little blood vessels that increase surface area. Same process here, again, tiny little air sacs increasing the surface area to maximize gas pressure, or maximize surface area for gas exchange. So if you took one of your lungs and spread out all those tiny little alveoli, it would be about the size of a full piece of newspaper if you opened up all the quadrants of it. So quite a large surface area per lung because of these tiny little air sacs in there. Now, how do we know to breathe? Breathing is both voluntary and involuntary, right? So our cerebral cortex up here can consciously tell the diaphragm and ribs to breathe, right? Because those are obviously skeletal muscles and we control those voluntarily, right? But there's also involuntary processes. So you have sensory neurons in the arteries of your aorta and your carotid arteries. Those are the ones that go up to your head. And these sensors sense the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen. And when oxygen gets low and carbon dioxide gets high, they're going to send a signal, these sensors, to the parts of the brain called the pons and the medulla oblongata. And the pons and the medulla oblongata are going to then respond by sending signals to the motor neurons in your ribs and your diaphragm, telling you to increase contractions, to increase the rate of breathing. So you don't necessarily have to think about this. If you're running around, your breathing is going to increase involuntarily. You don't have to think about your breathing. Your lower brain, your pons and your medulla oblongata, do that involuntarily. So breathing is both a voluntary and an involuntary process. Okay. Last thing I'm going to talk about with breathing and oxygen is the interesting thing about hemoglobin. Turns out that hemoglobin doesn't always like oxygen. Sometimes it really likes oxygen, sometimes it doesn't like oxygen as much. So when does it really like oxygen? Well, it really likes oxygen when there's a high concentration of oxygen in your lungs. So let's say there's a maximum amount of oxygen in your lungs. Almost all of the hemoglobin is going to bind to oxygen and hold on to it. That's really good. That means that red blood cells, when they're in the capillaries around your lungs, are grabbing all the oxygen they can and they're holding on to it, right? Then as it travels into your body, the oxygen levels are going to go down, right? Because our cells are using oxygen. As it goes down, well, it turns out that the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen also goes down. So when it's around those cells, it's going to like oxygen a little less. It's going to give up the oxygen. Well, that's good because guess what? Those cells need the oxygen. Okay? If it gets into cells during exercise, those cells have really low concentrations of oxygen, and it really will give up a lot of the oxygen. It will keep almost none of the oxygen. So hemoglobin, fortunately for our cells, gives up oxygen when oxygen is in low concentration and binds to oxygen when oxygen is in high concentration in our lungs. So our lungs, it's going to bind and hold the oxygen, and our muscles and our organs, it's going to give it up. Okay? And there's even a little extra something that hemoglobin will do. It turns out if the pH of our blood, which is usually about 7.4, goes down to 7.2, now what causes that slight pH? Well, it turns out excess carbon dioxide in the blood forms carbonic acid, and that lowers the pH of the blood just a little bit. Well, what that means is hemoglobin likes oxygen even less. So it's going to give up even more of that because in this case we have excess carbon dioxide, which means our cells are using a lot more oxygen. So hemoglobin will, in the presence of excess carbon dioxide, give up even more. This is called a Bohr shift. And it basically shows that hemoglobin will give up not only its normal amount of oxygen, it'll give up much, much higher rates of oxygen so that our muscle cells and our cells that are using all that oxygen can get what they need to survive and to aerobically respire and keep going. So this is a quick overview of our respiratory system and how our lungs get oxygen to our blood and how hemoglobin can deliver it to our cells. Okay?